Walter and I were the perfect couple in Pinewood Hills, with a life built over 36 years. But everything fell apart the moment I found a gold bracelet hidden in his drawer, something that should never have been there. My intuition led me to discover a betrayal that no one could have imagined, and I decided to expose everything at the dinner where he would be honored. What happened that night changed our lives forever. Stay with me until the end and don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to follow this exciting story until the very end. I never expected that the life I had built for so many years would one day shatter in such a quiet, subtle way. For 36 years, Walter and I lived what everyone around Pinewood Hills called a perfect marriage, a small town just outside Vermont, where the seasons changed like clockwork, and neighbors waved from porches as if it were still the 1950s. People looked at us and saw a couple who had it all: stability, love, respect. But beneath the calm surface, the cracks had already begun to spread. It wasn't a sudden betrayal or a fight that shattered everything. It was a feeling, a creeping unease I couldn't shake. The way Walter's eyes would avoid mine when I asked about his trips to Boston. The way his phone screen would light up and then quickly go dark whenever I entered the room. Little things at first, so small I almost told myself I was imagining it. But the uneasiness grew, gnawing at my heart. Walter's work took him to conferences in Boston frequently. He said they were important for his position at the local manufacturing plant. I trusted him. I wanted to trust him. I'd spent decades standing by his side, supporting his dreams, and sacrificing my own. One afternoon, while tidying the guest room, I found it. A delicate gold bracelet tucked away in the bottom drawer of his bedside table. It wasn't mine. I knew that instantly. I didn't recognize it, and it gleamed with a polished shine that didn't belong in our modest home. That bracelet was the first thread unraveling the tapestry I thought was unbreakable. At first I felt anger, sharp, burning rage that made my hands tremble. But then came confusion. Would Walter hide something like this? Was this a gift? From whom? The thoughts raced in my mind, each one worse than the last. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe a gift for a colleague or a relative. But my heart whispered truths I didn't want to face. I began watching, discreetly, piecing together his routine. The nights he stayed out late, the hushed phone calls, the careful avoidance of eye contact. Pieces came together painfully, like shards of glass cutting into my chest. There was one name I heard whispered among the neighbors: Linda. A widow who had moved to Pinewood Hills a few years back. Known for her sharp wit and social ambitions, she hosted gatherings and was slowly weaving herself into the fabric of our small community. I had met her briefly, always polite but distant. I didn't want to believe Walter could be involved with her, but the signs were undeniable. Every moment I spent doubting was another moment of suffering. The home that was once my sanctuary now felt cold and unfamiliar. I would sit at the kitchen table in the early morning hours, staring at the steaming cup of coffee I no longer wanted to drink, wondering where the man I loved had gone. One day, while Walter was away on one of his usual trips, I summoned the courage to confront the truth directly. I asked a mutual acquaintance if they had seen anything between Walter and Linda. The answer was a careful nod and a hushed confession. They had been seen together, more than once, in the cafes down close. Too close to be just friends. The world tilted beneath my feet. My heart broke slowly, over weeks and months, as I watched my husband slip further away. But I refused to be broken with him. I started to plan. Not out of malice, but because I needed to reclaim my dignity. If Walter thought he could humiliate me in silence, he was wrong. There was a gala coming up at the community center, an event where Walter would be publicly honored for his years of dedication to the town's industry. Everyone would be there, neighbors, colleagues, even Linda. I would not let him steal the night. Carefully, I gathered the evidence. The bracelet, discreet photos from the gatherings where Walter and Linda were spotted, and the whispered confessions from people too kind to speak directly to him. The night of the gala arrived, and I wore my strength like armor. The lights shone bright in the decorated hall. Faces smiled and chatted, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Walter stood at the podium, accepting his award, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on me. I could see confusion flicker there, then something darker, fear. I stepped forward calmly, holding the bracelet in my hand, my voice steady as I revealed the truth. The silence that followed was suffocating. Walter's words failed him, his facade cracked in front of the entire community. I felt a surge of power mixed with sorrow. This was the moment I had waited for, the moment I took back control. Even as I stood there, victorious in a way, I felt the weight of everything we had lost, and I knew this was only the beginning of a much longer, harder journey. That night, as I lay awake, I realized that sometimes the greatest strength is not in hiding pain, but in facing it head-on, no matter how unbearable it might be. I don't know what the future holds for Walter and me, but I am no longer the woman who silently endured. Truth was out, but the real story, the one that would change everything, was still hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The morning after the gala, silence filled the house like an unwelcome guest. Walter didn't speak a word, and I sat at the kitchen table clutching the empty coffee cup as if it could anchor me to some solid truth. The neighbors whispered behind closed doors, their eyes shifting with a mixture of pity and curiosity. My world had tilted violently, and the cracks in the life I'd thought so steady were now glaringly visible. For years I had built my identity around being Walter's wife, the mother of our children, the pillar of this small town. But now, as I faced the hollow spaces he left behind, I began to realize how much I had lost of myself along the way. Walter's distant stares and cold silences gnawed at my days. He retreated deeper into himself, avoiding any glance that might betray the guilt I knew weighed heavily on him. I watched him struggle, and though anger still burned within me, a different kind of sorrow began to seep through. The sorrow of watching a man unravel before my eyes, the man I had loved for so long. Days turned into weeks. The routine of our life persisted, but the warmth was gone. Our children called often, trying to keep peace, but I sensed the tension bleeding through their voices. I spent my afternoons wandering through the fields behind our house, the wind brushing past me like a whisper of forgotten dreams. One afternoon, while sorting through old photo albums, I found a picture of us on our wedding day. Walter's eyes shone with hope and promise. I traced the lines of his face with a trembling finger, remembering the man I thought I knew. The man who once swore to stand by me no matter what. It was then that I realized this wasn't just about betrayal or infidelity. It was about all the silent sacrifices, the unspoken loneliness we had both carried for decades. The quiet coldly chipped away at the foundation of our marriage. In the weeks that followed, I found myself confronting memories I had long buried. The nights Walter came home late, distracted and distant. My own moments of doubt and despair. The way we both had stopped truly seeing each other. But as the days grew colder, and the Vermont snow began to blanket our little town, I knew I couldn't let the pain consume me. I had to find a way to live again, to rediscover the woman I had been before the years and wounds. One evening, Walter came to me unexpectedly. His voice was low and unsteady as he admitted the mistakes he had made, the loneliness he had felt, and the emptiness he tried to fill with someone else. His confession was raw and painful, but it was also the first honest conversation we had had in a long time. For the first time, I saw not just the man who had hurt me, but the flawed human beneath, lost, scared, and desperate for connection. It didn't heal everything. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it was a start. Together we began to navigate the fragile path toward understanding, confronting the mistakes and the silences that had pushed us apart. I learned that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting, but about choosing to face the pain and move forward despite it. Our journey was far from easy. There were moments when anger flared and despair threatened to overwhelm. But amid the darkness, a fragile hope began to grow. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time I felt a spark, a chance at something new, born from the ashes of what we had lost. The weeks after Walter's confession were a strange blur of emotions, hope tangled with pain, forgiveness laced with lingering hurt. Our conversations became tentative bridges across a deep chasm of mistrust. I wasn't sure if the old Walter was still inside, or if what remained was someone I barely recognized. Yet, despite everything, I held on to the fragile possibility of healing. Every morning I watched him leave for work, the same quiet man with a guarded look, carrying the weight of his mistakes like a shadow trailing behind. I, too, carried my burden, the ache of betrayal and the slow unraveling of a life I once trusted. But there was a stubborn part of me that refused to let this be the end. One day, as the cold Vermont wind swept through the bare trees, I found myself wandering to the little cafe down Main Street, a place where Linda often gathered with her circle. It was a simple act of courage, maybe even defiance. I needed to understand the world Walter had stepped into. Inside, the room hummed with quiet chatter, the clinking of cups and soft laughter echoing beneath the warm glow of hanging lights. I sat in a corner, watching Linda carefully. She was everything I expected and more, poised, confident. But there was a shadow in her eyes, a restless hunger that didn't quite reach contentment. Watching her made me realize that Walter's betrayal was more than just an act of selfishness. It was part of a deeper unraveling, a search for something missing in both their lives. The more I observed, the clearer it became that Linda's ambition masked a loneliness similar to Walter's. That night, I wrestled with a confusing mixture of anger and pity. The town might whisper of Linda's intentions, but beneath the surface, she was just as vulnerable. It was a cruel twist that the two people who hurt me were themselves broken in ways I hadn't yet understood. Back home, I threw myself into the rhythms of everyday life. The children visited when they could, bringing laughter and momentary relief. Grandchildren's innocent questions reminded me of the simple joys I had almost forgotten. Still, in the quiet hours, the house felt heavy with silence. One evening, Walter and I sat together by the fireplace. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the room. We didn't speak much at first. Words were heavy and wounds raw. But slowly, a shared understanding grew in the space between us. We spoke of regrets, of the loneliness that had crept in when work and routine filled the gaps in our connection. I shared my own fears and disappointments. There were tears, his and mine, and for the first time in months, I felt something fragile bloom between us, a tentative hope. Yet as the days passed, I noticed Walter slipping back into old patterns. The distance returned, the guarded looks and unspoken doubts. I questioned whether this fragile truce could hold, or if the scars were too deep to ever heal. I kept the bracelet hidden away. It was a symbol of the betrayal, but also a reminder of my strength, the moment I chose to fight back instead of surrendering to despair. One afternoon, as I was tending the garden, I saw Linda across the street, watering her roses. Our eyes met briefly, and in that silent moment, a strange empathy passed between us. Two women, wounded by the same man, caught in the tangled web of pain and longing. It was a bitter comfort. That evening, as snow began to fall gently outside, I sat by the window, watching the world fade into white. I realized that suffering was not a sign of weakness, but a testament to the depth of love and hope I still carried. Though the path ahead was uncertain and filled with hardship, I was determined to face it with courage. I was no longer just Walter's wife. I was a woman reclaiming her story, piece by fragile piece. And in that, I found a strength I hadn't known I possessed. Don't miss the next videos. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Back to the story. The cold crept deeper into the bones of our home that winter, mirroring the frost settling between Walter and me. Days stretched out in a long, silent ache, each one heavier than the last. I kept busy with chores and the garden, but the warmth that once filled our house had been replaced by a cold, unspoken distance that no amount of effort seemed able to melt. I remember one particular morning, the kind where the sky was a dull gray blanket and the wind whispered cruel secrets through the bare branches. Walter was unusually quiet at breakfast, his gaze fixed on the untouched plate before him. I tried to break the silence with small talk, but my words felt hollow, slipping past like snowflakes melting on skin. He gave no answer, only a faint nod, and I knew that the gulf between us was widening. The discovery of the bracelet had been the first blow, but the real wound was the betrayal of trust, the feeling that the man I thought I knew had been a stranger all along. The thought gnawed at me, eating away at the memories of years spent side by side. How could a lifetime of shared moments be shattered by secret lies? Despite the cold, I refused to let despair take hold completely. There was a stubborn flame inside me, a refusal to be broken. I threw myself into the rhythms of daily life, the small tasks that tethered me to the present. Baking bread, knitting scarves, tending to the little garden that stubbornly clung to life even under the snow. One afternoon, while sorting through old letters in the attic, I found a bundle tied with faded ribbon. They were letters Walter had written me before we were married, full of hope and promises. As I read his words, a wave of nostalgia swept over me, a reminder of a time when love was simple and dreams were endless. But even then, beneath the sweetness, I sensed the shadow of doubt that had grown into the chasm we faced now. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wrestling with the storm inside. I thought of the times I had closed my eyes to signs, of the quiet moments when I felt alone despite his presence. The truth was painful, but it was also a chance to confront the reality of our lives. Walter and I began to meet in the kitchen late at night, sharing quiet cups of tea and hesitant words. Those moments were fragile, like the first thaw after a long winter, tentative but filled with possibility. We spoke of our regrets, our fears, and the silence that had grown between us. It was the first time in months that I felt a flicker of connection, but the wounds were deep, and healing was slow. There were days when anger flared, and the past possible to overcome. Other times the weight of sorrow pressed down so heavily that I thought I might crumble beneath it. One evening, as the snow fell thick outside, Walter surprised me with a small, simple gesture. A bouquet of wildflowers he had picked from a forgotten corner of the garden. It was imperfect, a little battered by the cold, but it was enough to break through the walls we had built. In that moment, I realized that love wasn't just about grand declarations or perfect moments. It was about choosing each day to keep fighting, to keep hoping, even when the road was dark and uncertain. The town around us carried on, oblivious to the quiet battles we fought behind closed doors. Neighbors exchanged polite greetings, children played in the snow, and the seasons turned with relentless certainty. Yet inside, our world was changing, shifting from brokenness toward something new. It was not a story of fairy tale endings or sudden miracles, but of slow, painful growth and the strength found in enduring. As the days grew longer and the first hints of spring appeared, I felt a optimism bloom within me. The scars remained, but they were no longer wounds that festered in silence. They were marks of survival, proof of a journey through darkness toward light. Walter and I were still far from perfect, still learning to navigate the fragile terrain of trust and forgiveness. But we were moving forward, one small step at a time. And in that, there was hope. The subtle thaw that began with the first hints of spring carried with it a fragile promise, one that I clung to with equal parts hope and caution. For decades I had defined my life through Walter. His laughter was my comfort, his presence my anchor. Now, as the days lengthened and buds emerged from the barren trees, I found myself searching not only for renewal in the world around me, but also for the woman I had lost somewhere along the way. Walter and I still navigated the delicate dance of rebuilding trust. Each conversation was a thread, weaving a new fabric from the frayed strands of our past. I could see the weight of guilt in his eyes, but also a quiet determination not to lose what remained between us. We shared moments that were both painfully honest and tenderly hopeful. One afternoon, I accompanied Walter to a community event, something we hadn't done together in months. All was alive with familiar faces, the hum of laughter, and the clatter of plates. We sat side by side, and for a while, the ghosts of the past felt distant. It was in these small moments that I began to feel the slow pulse of life returning to our marriage. But the shadows of betrayal never fully vanished. I still held tight to the bracelet, its cold weight a reminder of the fractures beneath the surface. The memory of Linda lingered in the edges of my mind, a bitter taste that refused to fade. The seasons changed, and with summer came a new rhythm to our days. Walter and I took long walks through the fields surrounding Pinewood Hills, the sun warming our backs and the wildflowers painting the landscape with color. These walks were quiet, but the silence was no longer heavy. It was filled with unspoken understanding, the shared acknowledgement of wounds still healing. In those moments, I thought about the years we had spent together. Decades of shared dreams, sacrifices, and compromises. The love that had weathered storms and trials, though scarred, was not extinguished, yet the pain of betrayal left its mark. I found myself wrestling with moments of doubt, questioning if the fragile peace we found could withstand the weight of the past. At night, when the house was still, memories rose like ghosts, and tears came unbidden. One evening, after the children had left and the house was quiet, Walter sat beside me with a worn photo album. He traced the edges of pictures that captured moments from our youth, our wedding day, the births of our children, family vacations under open skies. His voice was soft as he spoke of his regrets and the hope that we could find a way back. It was the first time in months I allowed myself to believe that healing was possible. Not just for us, but for the life we had built. But healing was not a straight path. There were days when old wounds reopened, when the silence between us grew too loud to ignore. The weight of betrayal was heavy, and sometimes I felt I was drowning in a sea of pain. Still, I refused to give up. Our marriage had been forged in ordinary moments, shared cups of coffee, whispered prayers, and the steady rhythm of daily life. It was in these moments that I found the strength to keep going. One afternoon, while walking near the river that edged our town, Walter stopped and took my hand. The gesture was simple, but it carried a depth of meaning that words could not capture. I squeezed his hand back, feeling the fragile thread of connection grow stronger. In the months that followed, we continued to rebuild, not as the couple we once were, but as two people who had been broken and were learning to be whole again. Scars remained, a reminder of the pain and the growth it brought. But with each step forward, I found a deeper understanding of love, one that embraced imperfection and the resilience of the human heart. Our story was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and moments of doubt. But I was no longer afraid. I was ready to face whatever came next, with courage, grace, and an open heart. Don't miss the next videos. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Back to the story. Spring had given way to summer in Pinewood Hills, bringing warmth and life back to the town. But inside our home, the echoes of past betrayals still lingered. Walter and I had come a long way from the silent dinners and cold silences, but the journey toward healing was slow and often painful. Each day demanded patience, forgiveness, and a willingness to confront the shadows that had taken root in our marriage. Walter had become quieter in these months, perhaps weighed down by guilt or simply unsure of how to rebuild what he had broken. I watched him more closely, searching for signs of the man I once knew, the man I still hoped could be. Our conversations were more open now, though careful and cautious, like tiptoeing on fragile ice. One morning I found him sitting in his favorite armchair, staring out the window at the garden we had tended together for years. His hands were clenched tightly, and the lines on his face seemed deeper than ever before. I wanted to reach out, to say something that might ease his burden, but the right words escaped me. The weight of his silence was almost unbearable, and yet it was a reminder that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about facing pain head-on. As the days passed, I found solace in the small joys of summer, the vibrant colors of blooming flowers, the laughter of children playing in the streets, the smell of fresh-cut grass on warm afternoons. These moments grounded me, reminding me that life continued despite the fractures in my heart. Walter and I began to attend community events together again, trying to rebuild the life we had once shared with neighbors and friends. The townspeople noticed the shift, some with surprise, others with quiet hope. I felt a subtle Linda's name whispered through conversations, a reminder of the betrayal that still cast its long shadow. But I refused to let it define me or the life Walter and I were striving to rebuild. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky with hues of pink and gold, Walter invited me to walk through the woods near our home. The trees swayed gently, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. We walked in silence at first, the crunch of leaves beneath our feet the only sound. Then, Walter stopped and looked at me with eyes full of regret and hope. He apologized, not just for his actions, but for the pain he caused over the years, through distance and silence. His words were heartfelt, fragile, and I felt a tear slip down my cheek. For the first time, I sensed a true willingness in him to change, to fight for what we had lost. Our journey was far from over, but in that moment, a fragile seed of trust began to take root again. The days that followed were filled with small gestures, shared meals, quiet talks, and moments of laughter that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. I found myself daring to dream again, to believe that love could survive even the deepest wounds. Yet, beneath the surface, the memories of betrayal still haunted me. Some nights, when the house was still, I would find myself clutching the bracelet, feeling the cold metal against my skin, a tangible reminder of the pain and the resilience it inspired. Walter and I were learning to live with the past, not let it define our future. One afternoon, I stumbled upon an old recipe book filled with notes in Walter's handwriting. It reminded me of the simple joys we once shared, cooking meals together, celebrating holidays with family, and the quiet comfort of everyday routines. Inspired, I invited Walter to cook dinner with me, the kitchen filled with warmth and laughter as we stumbled through recipes, rekindling a connection that felt both new and familiar. In these moments, I realized that healing was not about grand gestures or instant forgiveness. It was about the slow, steady work of rebuilding trust day by day. As summer deepened, so did our commitment to each other. We still carried the scars, but they were no longer wounds that festered in silence. They were reminders of the journey we had endured and the strength we had found. Our story was one of resilience, of two flawed people choosing to face pain and grow together. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, I was ready to walk it with Walter, hand in hand, step by step. The summer slowly faded into early autumn, and with the changing leaves came a quiet transformation in Walter and me. Our days were still tinged with the residue of past wounds, but the sharp edges had begun to soften. There was a tentative peace settling into our lives, fragile yet persistent. I often found myself reflecting on how far we had come from those dark, silent nights after the gala. The weight of betrayal had not vanished, but I had learned to carry it differently, with a mixture of sorrow and strength. The bracelet, once a symbol of broken trust, had become a reminder of the resilience I had discovered within myself. Walter and I spent many afternoons sitting on the porch, watching the slow dance of the falling leaves, sharing memories of our past and hopes for what could still be. These moments were quiet, but meaningful, stitching new threads of connection into the fabric of our marriage. One afternoon, as the sun cast a golden glow over the fields, Walter suggested we visit the old church where we had been married all those years ago. It was a place filled with echoes of our youth, a sanctuary that had witnessed the beginning of our story. Walking hand in hand through the familiar wooden doors, I felt a rush of memories flood back, the vows we exchanged, the dreams we shared, and the promise of forever that had seemed so certain. Sitting in the worn pews, we talked softly about the past, the mistakes, and the pain, but also about forgiveness and the fragile hope for renewal. It was a sacred moment, not of grand declarations, but of quiet reconciliation. The community around us had noticed the change too. Neighbors who once whispered now greeted us with warm smiles. There was a sense of acceptance that slowly replaced the judgment that had hung in the air. Yet, even as we moved forward, the shadows of Linda and the betrayal lingered like distant storms. I did not forget what had happened, but I chose not to let it define the rest of my life. One chilly evening, as the first frost settled on the windows, Walter surprised me with a small gathering of family and close friends. The room was filled with laughter, stories, and the comforting presence of loved ones. It was a celebration, not just of Walter's contributions to the town, but of the resilience and love that had sustained us. I watched Walter as he smiled, surrounded by those who cared for him. In that moment, I realized how much we had both grown, how the pain we endured had forged a new understanding between us. But the most profound change was within me. I was no longer just Walter's wife or the woman betrayed. I was a person reborn through suffering and hope. That night, as I lay in bed beside Walter, I felt a peace not known in years. The journey had been long and painful, filled with tears and silence, but it had led us to a place where love, though imperfect, could thrive once more. We still carried scars, but they were badges of survival, reminders that even broken hearts could mend. Our story was not one of perfection or fairy tale endings. It was the story of two flawed souls who faced darkness and chose to find light together. And as the autumn leaves fell gently outside, I knew that whatever the future held, we would face it with courage, grace, and the quiet strength born from enduring the deepest pain. Don't miss the next videos. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. Back to the story. Years have a way of folding over each other, like pages in a well-worn book, each one layered with stories of joy, pain, and growth. As I sit here now, looking back on the journey Walter and I have traveled, I see a tapestry woven with threads of sorrow and strength, betrayal and forgiveness, loss and rediscovery. This is the final chapter of our story, a story that began with heartbreak, but ends with a light I never thought I'd find again. After the bitter winter and the fragile spring, summer's warmth finally settled deep into our bones. Walter and I learned to live alongside our scars, rather than be defined by them. The bracelet that once burned in my hand had been tucked away, not forgotten, but transformed into a symbol of resilience. Every time I saw it, I remembered the moment I chose to stand up for myself, to demand truth and dignity. One afternoon, as golden leaves fluttered outside our window, Walter and I sat in silence. It wasn't the heavy silence of those early months after the betrayal, filled with unspoken accusations and cold distance. This was a quiet comfort, a peace born from years of shared struggle. I looked at him and saw not the man who had hurt me, but the flawed, tender human who had journeyed beside me through the darkest storms. Our children had grown, their own lives full of complexities and joys. They no longer needed us in the same way, but the bond we shared remained unbroken. We found new rhythms in our days, morning coffee on the porch, evening walks through the woods, moments of laughter and tears alike. But the true turning point came one chilly autumn evening. Walter reached into his pocket and pulled out a small worn box. Inside was the bracelet, the very one that had first shattered my world. He looked at me with eyes full of remorse and hope. "I want you to have this back," he said softly. Not as a reminder of pain, but as a symbol of how far we've come, of everything we've survived. I took it gently, the cold metal warm now with meaning. It was more than jewelry. It was a testament to forgiveness, to the strength it took to rebuild. We talked long into the night about the past, the mistakes, the pain, the moments we almost gave up, but also about the love that endured beneath it all, stubborn and fierce. That night, I realized the truth I had carried with me all along, that love is not a perfect story, but a journey filled with struggles and triumphs, tears and laughter, endings and new beginnings. Our marriage wasn't the fairy tale I had once dreamed of. It was something more real, messy, complicated, but utterly human. Through the pain and betrayal, I discovered my own strength, the strength to forgive, to heal, and to embrace the life I still had. Walter and I had passed through the fire, scarred but not destroyed, and as the years stretched ahead, I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, with hearts wide open. Our story closes here, not with the weight of sorrow, but with the light of hope and the promise of new chapters yet to be written.